The dock smelled like rust, salt, and secrets. It always did, especially at 3 a.m., when the container ships groaned against their moorings and the fog rolled in thick enough to swallow a man whole. And on this particular Tuesday morning in the port of Baltimore, a man was swallowed whole. Not by the fog. By something far more patient. Far more calculating. His name was Rico Vega. 19 years old. 160 pounds of quiet intensity wrapped in a North Face jacket 2 sizes too big. To anyone watching from a distance, he looked like just another kid, the kind you'd see lingering outside a corner store, hood up, eyes down. But if you were watching closely, if you were watching from the right angle, you'd notice something different. You'd notice that every longshoreman who passed him gave a small nod. That every dock supervisor suddenly found somewhere else to look. That the security guard at Gate 7, a 20-year veteran who'd survived 2 union strikes and a federal audit, stepped aside without being asked. Because Rico Vega didn't need to ask. At 19 years old, in a port that moved $4 billion of cargo every single year, Rico was the asking. How does a teenager, a child technically still years from being able to rent a car, come to control one of the busiest commercial ports on the eastern seaboard? That's exactly the question that would consume federal investigators for the better part of 3 years. It would fill courtroom transcripts with 1,200 pages of testimony. It would end careers, destroy families, and send 23 people to federal prison. But before all of that, before the warrants, the wiretaps, the pre-dawn raids, there was just a boy from Locust Point who was very, very good at reading people. Rico grew up in the shadow of the port. Literally. The cranes were visible from the bedroom window of the apartment where he lived with his grandmother, Cecilia, and his 2 younger cousins. His mother had left when he was 6, a detail he never explained and no one dared ask about. His father, Marco Vega, had worked the docks for 11 years before a workplace injury took 2 of his fingers and eventually his spirit. Marco still shuffled around the neighborhood, bitter and broke, a cautionary tale in steel-toed boots. But Rico had watched his father. Watched how the dock worked. Watched the rhythms of the cargo, what came in, what went out, what never made it to the manifest. He was 12 years old the first time he understood that the port wasn't just a place where ships docked. It was a machine. And like any machine, it had gaps. Pressure points. Places where, if you applied exactly the right kind of leverage, extraordinary things could happen. By 15 he was running errands for a mid-level operator named Boots Carrera, picking up envelopes, delivering messages, keeping his mouth shut and his eyes open. By 17 he had memorized every shift rotation at every gate. He knew which inspectors took lunch at 11, which ones stayed late to pad their overtime, and which ones had gambling debts that made them flexible. And by 19? Rico had built something that law enforcement would later describe, in a carefully worded federal indictment, as a sophisticated criminal enterprise leveraging systemic vulnerabilities within the port's labor and logistics infrastructure. In the neighborhood they had a simpler name for it. They called it Rico's Kingdom. What passed through that kingdom would shock you. Not just drugs, though there were drugs, of course, moving through hollowed-out engine blocks and false-bottomed refrigeration units. But also weapons. Stolen electronics. Counterfeit pharmaceuticals. Even people on 2 documented occasions that still haven't been fully prosecuted. The port was Rico's private toll road and everything that moved through it paid a fee. And yet, here is the thing that made Rico truly dangerous, the thing that set him apart from every other ambitious young criminal who tried to work the docks before him. He was almost impossible to hate. Cecilia Vega told investigators later that her grandson had never once raised his voice in her home. Teachers remembered him as quiet, attentive, almost unervingly polite. Even the federal prosecutor assigned to his case admitted in a recorded interview that Rico Vega was the most composed 19-year-old I have ever encountered in any context. He didn't swagger. Didn't flash money. Didn't post anything on social media. He drove a 6-year-old Honda Civic and paid his grandmother's electric bill on time every month. The neighborhood loved him. The dockworkers respected him. Even some of the men who were, technically, supposed to be investigating him had developed something uncomfortably close to admiration. For 2 years Rico moved untouched through his kingdom. For 2 years, every attempt to build a case against him collapsed. Witnesses recanted, evidence disappeared, informants suddenly remembered they had nothing to say. For 2 years, it seemed like Rico Vega was simply untouchable. And then, on a Thursday evening in late October, a phone rang in the Baltimore field office of the FBI. The agent who answered it would later say the call lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. That in those 4 minutes and 11 seconds, everything changed. The caller didn't give a name. But the voice was familiar to anyone who knew the Vega family. The accent, the cadence, the particular way certain words were shaped. The call came from inside Rico's world. From inside his blood. And what that caller said, what they were willing to give up and why, is a story so dark, so layered with betrayal and buried rage, that even now, years later, the people closest to it struggle to talk about it without going quiet in the middle of their sentences. Because some betrayals don't just destroy empires. They hollow out everything that came before them too. If this story already has you gripped, if you're already asking yourself who made that call, you're not alone. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss what comes next. Because trust me, the truth is worse than anything you're imagining right now. The FBI agent who answered that call was Special Agent Diane Kowalski. 38 years old. 12 years in the bureau. She had worked gang cases in Detroit, trafficking networks in Miami, and a money laundering operation so complex it had taken 4 years and 2 grand juries to untangle. She was not a woman who rattled easily. But she would later tell her supervising agent that the phone call she received that Thursday evening gave her a feeling she hadn't felt since her very first case. The feeling that something enormous was about to break open. The caller spoke carefully. Deliberately. Like someone who had rehearsed the words many times but was still terrified of saying them out loud. They gave names. Dates. Shipment numbers. Container codes. Details so specific, so internally consistent, that Kowalski knew within 60 seconds this wasn't a tip. This was someone who had been inside. Someone who knew Rico's operation not from the outside looking in, but from a seat at the table. The caller gave one final piece of information before hanging up. A name. Not Rico's name. Someone else. Someone who was one of Rico's most trusted lieutenants. One of only 4 people who knew the full architecture of the operation. The name the caller gave was Daniel Vega. Rico's older cousin. 24 years old. The same cousin who had grown up in the same apartment, slept in the bunk above Rico for 11 years, and who Rico had personally elevated from street-level runner to the operational core of his entire empire. Kowalski sat very still after the call ended. Then she picked up her pen and wrote 2 words at the top of a fresh legal pad. Family betrayal. Here is what you need to understand about Daniel Vega, because the story doesn't make sense without him. Daniel was not like Rico. Where Rico was quiet, Daniel was loud. Where Rico was disciplined, Daniel was hungry, always hungry for more money, more respect, more of everything, in the way that people are hungry when they feel they've been underpaid for too long. He had brought Rico into the port world in the first place, had introduced a 15-year-old Rico to Boots Carrera, had vouched for him, had spent 2 years pulling him through the early education of how the docks worked. And then he had watched his teenage cousin surpass him so completely that there was no longer any comparison to be made. By the time Rico was 19 and running the operation, Daniel was 24 and taking orders from him. The older cousin, the one who had started all of this, now reported to the younger one. To everyone around them it looked fine. Daniel smiled at the right times. Showed up when he was supposed to. There were no public moments of friction. But Kowalski had been doing this long enough to know that the most dangerous resentments are the ones that never show on the surface. The ones that go underground and keep growing in the dark until one day they're too large to contain. She began building her case. What came next unfolded over 61 days. Wiretaps placed on 14 phones. Surveillance across 6 locations. A confidential informant, Daniel, now fully cooperating, walking investigators through the operation from the inside with a precision that left prosecutors almost breathless. Every detail checked out. Every name, every account, every container number. Daniel gave them everything. And as the picture came together, it was even larger than Kowalski had anticipated. Rico had built a parallel economy inside the port, a second set of books running beneath the official one, invisible to every audit because the people doing the auditing were on his payroll. The numbers, when finally calculated, would exceed $40 million. But here is where the story turns. Here is where it stops being about money and starts being about something older and darker. Because as Kowalski dug deeper into Daniel's cooperation, inconsistencies began to surface. Small ones at first, a date that didn't line up, an account number that didn't match. She ran them down. And what she found on the other side stopped her cold. Daniel hadn't just called the FBI to avoid prison. He had been planning this for months before that call. Systematically. Carefully. He had been redirecting, not money which would have been noticed, but relationships. Port contacts. Supervisor loyalties. The human infrastructure that Rico's entire operation depended on. Quietly, methodically pulling those threads toward himself, building his own shadow network inside Rico's shadow network, waiting for the moment when the original would collapse and he could step into the space it left behind. He hadn't called the FBI to destroy Rico. He had called the FBI to use them. To let the federal government do the dirty work of removing his cousin so that Daniel Vega could inherit the kingdom he believed had always been rightfully his. The morning Kowalski realized this, she sat in her car in the parking structure for 11 minutes without moving. Because if she was right, and she was almost certain she was right, then the informant wasn't a witness. He was the real story. And Rico had no idea that the ground beneath his kingdom had already been given away. The arrest happened on a Wednesday morning at 6:47 a.m. Rico was in the kitchen of his grandmother's apartment, making coffee. Not in some safe house. Just standing in a small kitchen with yellow curtains and a church calendar pinned to the wall, waiting for the coffee to finish brewing like any other person on any other morning. That detail, the yellow curtains, the coffee, the absolute normalcy of it, would stay with the agents long after the case was closed. Rico heard the knock. Opened the door. Looked at the badges, the vests, the controlled urgency of 12 federal agents. And then he nodded. Not in defeat. Not in surprise. In the quiet way of someone who has known for some time that a particular moment was coming and has already made peace with it. He asked only one thing, that someone stay with his grandmother until her neighbor could come, because Cecilia had a heart condition and he didn't want her to be alone. The request was granted. He didn't say another word for 11 hours. In the interrogation room, Rico sat across from Kowalski with the stillness of a man 3 times his age. He had waived his right to an attorney temporarily, not because he intended to talk, but because he wanted to look at the person who had built the case against him. Kowalski placed a photograph on the table. Daniel. His cousin. Taken outside the field office 3 weeks earlier. Rico looked at the photograph for a long moment. Something moved through his expression, not anger. Something more like the grief of confirmed suspicion. How long? He asked. His first words in 11 hours. Kowalski told him. 18 months. The redirected contacts. The shadow network. The calculated use of federal investigators as instruments of personal ambition. Rico absorbed this. Then he looked up. He wasn't wrong, he said quietly. About what he thought he deserved. Kowalski hadn't expected that. Then why didn't you give it to him? She asked. Because he stopped asking, Rico said. People who stop asking and start taking, you can't build anything with them. I was going to transition him. 6 months out, maybe less. I was already planning it. He paused. He didn't know that. Think about what that means. 2 men from the same family, raised in the same apartment, shaped by the same poverty, circling each other for 18 months in a silence so total that neither knew what the other was actually doing. Daniel dismantling what he thought was a throne that would never be his. Rico preparing to hand it over. 2 plans. Moving in opposite directions. Neither visible to the other. The trial lasted 19 days. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Container records, financial forensics, testimony from 14 port employees, and 1 cooperating witness whose sentence had been significantly reduced in exchange for his cooperation. Daniel testified for 6 hours. The jury believed him. Rico's defense argued competently and thoroughly. They were also arguing against $40 million of forensic accounting. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. Guilty on 14 counts. Daniel received 4 years with parole possible at 2.5. He walked out of federal prison 29 months after the verdict and moved to a city whose name was placed under seal. A new beginning, purchased with his cousin's destruction. The shadow network he had spent 18 months building inside Rico's operation was never fully dismantled. Kowalski knew it. The prosecutors suspected it. But the evidence existed mostly in patterns of behavior rather than hard documentation. Not enough to charge. Enough to understand. Daniel Vega had played the longest game in the room. And in one devastating sense he had won. Rico was sentenced to 22 years. He was 19 years old at the time of his arrest. He would be 41 before he was eligible for release. Cecilia Vega attended every day of the trial. She sat in the same seat in the 3rd row, dressed carefully, her hands folded in her lap. When the verdict was read, she didn't cry. She sat very still, the way Rico had sat very still in the interrogation room, and you understood then where he had learned it. On the day of sentencing, Rico turned to look at her before they took him out. Just once. Whatever passed between them in that look belonged only to them. Ricardo King Rico Vega built an empire at an age when most people are still figuring out their direction. He moved $40 million through a system that armies of regulators couldn't crack. He did it with intelligence, with patience, with a quality of perception that, redirected, might have built something extraordinary and legitimate. And he was destroyed not by law enforcement, not by a rival, but by the one person he had already decided to trust with everything. The one person who never knew. There is a particular kind of tragedy that lives at the intersection of loyalty and silence, where two people who might have reached each other simply never do, because one honest conversation never happened. Rico and Daniel Vega stand as a monument to that tragedy. One in a federal prison. One in a sealed city. Both unreachable. Both, in their own way, alone. What would you have done? If you were Rico, knowing you were already planning to give Daniel everything he wanted, would you have told him sooner? Would one conversation have changed everything? We will never know. Neither will they.